Like if I can give you anything that's empowering for you to understand that, like once you get to a place where it's a habit, it's so much easier to maintain that habit. All right, what is up? Episode 7 of Pursuit of Balance, Season 2. We're going to talk about why we know better, but why we don't do better, right? And this is basically the knowledge to behavior gap that most of us are dealing with. And this actually was brought up last night. So thanks to Ariel for the recommendation on what we were going through today, because one of the things that as far as running a podcast is I have a lot of things that I write down a lot, and I don't have a lot of things sometimes that I personally feel I'm like, is someone actually gonna have some value behind this or take this and actually like this content or topic? So this was something that was brought up for one of our clients in Palo Alto. And basically what the whole premise is, and I think this is something that it resonated with me the most, which is hence why I'm doing it today. How a lot of times in life we have an overabundance of knowledge or access to knowledge and information, but we don't have a lot of behavioral change, right? And there's this gap in life, and I obviously want to keep this a little bit more specific to health today if I can, but just really the psychological attachment to it. But there's this gap in the behavior change that actually happens. And I think this is so normal, and I mean, for every single human out there. And why this kind of resonated with me the most out of all the things that I got suggestions on yesterday was like, I was talking about this in Flat, which is like our onboarding for new coaches. How like one of the things that, as coaches, what we struggle with is understanding, and I think any professional in any space kind of deals with this a little bit, is understanding the information is one thing, right? Like you obviously need to be knowledgeable enough to know how to train somebody or program or mobility or nutrition specific to a coach. But getting someone to actually make the changes and actually become compliant to it is, I think, where the biggest struggle tends to lie for so many of us. So today's podcast, I really wanted to just focus on really, I kind of broke it up into two big parts, right? Or three really technically, but two of them being the bigger parts. Number one is really the science behind it. And that's kind of where I spent most of the time kind of looking up stuff last night and this morning of like, okay, what are the actual like psychological and like what's the science behind it? Why do our brains have such a hard time taking knowledge in and not converting it to a behavior change, right? And a lot of times we tend to look at this as, I think from the outside perspective, or even sometimes an amateur professional perspective, coaching somebody, that we tend to look at it as like, oh, it's just a lack of willpower, or this person's lazy. Like, you shouldn't be snacking, or, you shouldn't be eating a certain foods, or, you should be taking a certain amount of steps. But why is that person still not doing it? Right. So I kind of wanted to break it down a little bit more, and I wanted to go into the science first, right? It's not, and like one of the things I wrote down is that we're not failing because we don't care or we're not lazy. Just like I said, it's really just like there's something in our brains that are causing us not to kind of think about that, right? So number one was like an evolutionary mismatch, right? Which I thought this was interesting when I was looking this up, which is they called it like ancient brain versus the modern world. And really, when you think about our stress response or our motivation systems and our decision making and how it's evolved over years as humans, right? When you think about how we used to be back then, right? When you think, and I talk about this a lot with stress, right? Some of the argument sometimes comes back with like, oh, well, like being a primal or 1,000 years ago or whatever it was, we were always stressed because we were stressed about getting food, or we were stressed about being attacked by an animal or something crazy like that, or the examples that we give. But in the reality is, it's like those are probably small micro doses of your day. Yes, maybe the food, but it was just like a part of our life, right? Fast forward to kind of the modern day human. We tend to have an overabundance of information and stimulus and little micro stresses throughout the day that compounds into us just being a little bit more chronically stressed and stuck in this sympathetic state, right? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is immediate rewards, right? The dopamine hit that we get as humans, right? So a lot of times, like if I were to give you guys a diet example, right? When you think about the dietary example of like, okay, me having a snack at night, right? So it's like I have a guilty pleasure. I'm a sweet tooth at heart. So it's like if I have sweets around the house, right? Even if I knew I didn't want to have that because maybe I was trying to be a little bit more controlled or strict in my diet for the time being in my season of life or things like that. If it's in the house, it's really hard for me to overcome the willpower because I would prefer the immediate pleasure, right? And that was kind of the first thing that I came through is like, okay, when you're looking at this, and it makes sense, it's like the body is going to always choose and the brain is always going to choose the easy route, the lazy route, and the immediate comfort, right? So when you think about this immediate dopamine hit, doesn't matter if I'm scrolling, on Instagram or from having a little snack or from eating something or from having a glass of wine, your body will choose unconsciously to take the immediate reward first over the long-term satisfaction or goal or long-term reward, right? So you're going to think about always we're seeking immediate rewards and our body's avoiding unnecessary effort, right? So skipping the gym, even though we know it's good for us, was like an example, right? So there's a lot of times we talk about this from a business perspective that a lot of people will skip gyms or skip their workouts or skip their mobility or skip the things that they know they need to do. And that's not a lack of knowing, right? That's a lack of behavior change, right? And the reason why, it's because it's hard, right? And I think one of the things that we need to remember is from a sustainability perspective of making change in your life, no matter what the thing is, right? Obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit more about health as always, but no matter what the change is, until there is an enjoyment or there is a habit that is created, it's really hard for us to overcome the work and the stress to get the step going, right? So something I say a lot in the beginning to people when they're like first joining or new members is I kind of say there's 21 days for a habit, 90 days for a lifestyle. And we put a 12-week commitment on our membership literally for this reason, right? That understanding that the first 3 weeks of anything new in your life, but the gym example here, that is going to be the hardest part of your workouts, right? And the reason why is because it's a habit that has not been built. It's a lot harder when your body has not been in the habit of training, meaning the intensity of the training, the soreness that you're going to deal with, the lack of comfort of knowing certain movements or even knowing the coaches or people. Like there's just a lot more hurdles that mentally we have to get over to create that habit. So when you think about making the behavior change for somebody joining a gym, they have to get over that initial hump first before they can even think about their body creating a habit, right? So the first 3 weeks, I think, in any journey, doesn't matter if you're changing your diet or if you're trying to change some lifestyle habits at home or if you're trying to get in the habit of working out, your body is always going to choose the immediate reward and satisfaction, aka kind of the easier way and the lazier way. It's much more comfortable for me to stay home than it is for me to go to the gym and work out and get my ass kicked. So you have to remember that when you kind of think about that, your body always is going to avoid unnecessary effort, right? Example I give, your brain doesn't know the difference between running from a lion and running from a Zoom call. It still dumps the same stress and the chemistry into your bloodstream, right? So coming back to kind of the stress response and the energy demand of making change, that was one thing to kind of think about is when you think about long-term goals or future problems, your body kind of in a sense, deprioritizes that, right? And it's not because it's not important to you, right? But you just got to remember just the immediate change. So second part to kind of this was the psychological barriers, the biases that trip us up. The present bias I thought was a pretty interesting thing. And I actually have never heard this, but there's just kind of a different way to talk about what we were talking about is we overvalue immediate rewards and we undervalue the future ones, right? The example being, hey, I'm eating a snack or a donut or something right now because it tastes good or it's in front of me or we had, a casual work day at Fridays at work. But my coach tells me I should be avoiding these type of things because I want to lose weight, right? The science behind it is, the brain is showing limbic systems that lights up more of the immediate rewards, right? While the prefrontal cortex is the long-term planning that struggles to compete, right? And this is basically just the science part that I didn't know, but this obviously just goes to show you that there is something psychologically and physiologically that is happening to our body, even on a hormonal level, of why we decide to make those short-term choices, right? Second one is the cognitive dissonance, right? Which is the easiest way to think about this is like we basically can have a couple different beliefs and a couple different views, right? And allowing our body to make the proper choice is not necessarily the easiest thing, right? So when you have two conflicting truths that you are dealing with, right? Like I want to be healthy, for example, versus I just skipped my workout again. These are two beliefs that that are existing in your body, right? So cognitive dissonance is basically the ability to be able to separate those two things and why most humans struggle with that. Right. So instead of changing the behavior, the brain is going to choose the story to reduce discomfort. Right. Next one is ego depletion. And I think really decision fatigue is really kind of the bottom line foundational part to this. And the example I was thinking about when I was writing this down was like, who was the guy? Mark Zuckerberg, right? There was this article that came out forever ago, and it was like, why do you wear the same outfit? Or maybe it was Steve Jobs, one of those two. Like, why do you wear the same shirt and the same pair of jeans? I think it was Steve Jobs, now that I think about it. And his response was decision fatigue, right? It was basically just this underlying thing that the more decisions that we make throughout the day, the less willpower we tend to have, right? I talk about this a lot with my wife and even sometimes with the team of like, I have a social battery just like every other person does, and your social battery gets drained when you have a lot of socializing. So, with my job of talking to a camera right now, or talking to clients, or talking to a team member, or whatever it is, I have all this going on throughout the day. So, by the time I get home, I actually don't have that much energy sometimes to go right back into conversating with my wife, which is sad, right? Now, the thing to remember is my wife is the most important person to me. So, out of all people, I should be having some charge left as far as the social battery example goes. She is always the person I'm going to prioritize. But I've found it hard in the beginning of my relationship because she actually has the exact opposite lifestyle. Even though she's working all day, she's remote. So, yes, she's having meetings or she's talking to potential clients or employees, but like, she doesn't get to see people face to face, right? So for her, she's super excited to see me. She doesn't have that same depletion that I was dealing with. And that was something that I thought was kind of interesting, is because when you think about decision fatigue, is the more hurdles you put in front of yourself, the more likely you are to fail, right? Which sounds very transparent, but or very easy to understand. But like Atomic Habits, James Clear, he talks about this a lot of like, if you want to make a habit change, you want to make the habit really, really easy to start, right? Meaning like a low barrier to entry. And if you want to change a bad habit, you got to make it really, really hard to access, right? So we did this, I couldn't tell you how long ago. It's been years, but basically like my wife and I were talking about like, how do we maybe like control or slow down some of the drinking Monday through Thursday? Because we're people that we have red wine every night. And what did we do? Oh yeah, the strategy basically I remember now was like, okay, I was like, instead of buying wine for the week or for whatever and having wine on like at the house or in the pantry or in the fridge or whatever, let's just, if we want to go buy wine, if we're breaking that day, let's just go to the grocery store every day. We buy one bottle, right? So instead of having a couple bottles at the house, it's always accessible. So that would be kind of like an example of like, okay, if I wanted to remove that bad habit, I want to make it harder for me to go get that thing, right? And you could do the exact opposite when you think about creating good habits, right? So I'll talk about this a little bit more on the kind of the acronym that was broken down, or that I broke down, of like, easy example. If I wanted to do mobility, I was talking about this in Flat this weekend. Instead of thinking about, a lot of people skip mobility, or they even skip warm-ups, or they rush their cooldowns because they don't find it as exciting, right? So I even think about that with conditioning when I program, is I'll put hard conditioning on fun strength exercises. So everyone loves the deadlift at Functional Lifestyles, but no one loves doing hard conditioning. So what I'll do is I'll do the deadlift day is also going to be the same day that has the tough conditioning, because I know that people will show up for the deadlifts, but they would not show up for conditioning and maybe a barbell strict press, because those are two things that are a little bit less exciting. So when you think about this decision fatigue, you know, we need to remember that we're trying to create an environment and a way to set up our lifestyle where we don't run into this, because whatever the thing that you're trying to change, we want to make it as likely and as possible for us to actually make that change, right? So the more elements of decisions that you need to make throughout the day, the more things that actually drain your energy throughout the day, the harder that becomes, right? Which leads me right into the next one, right? Which is basically environment over willpower. And I will forever be someone that preaches this. And it took me a while, and that's kind of where my six dimensions kind of got created personally, because I personally came from that like brashy kind of like, just you're lazy or you lack willpower, just like push through it. And the one thing that I do want to be clear on is there still always is going to be an element of lack of willpower and laziness that's involved with this, right? Like when you look at some of the elites and the most successful people in any space, right? It doesn't matter if it's in the gym or if it's athletes or if it's business people or, you know, anything in that space, right? They do have a degree of willpower that most people don't have, right? Their ability to embrace pain or embrace discomfort, their perspective that they take on that, I think will always be like an element of that conversation. So I do want to make it clear that like a lot of what I am talking about today, and even some of the stuff I looked up, was basically like kind of talking about that, like you don't need to worry about that. But it is still part of the conversation, right? So what I wanted to, this section is like the environment over willpower, which is basically kind of like this hidden master to our lifestyle that a lot of people don't think about, right? So, over 80% of our daily actions are habitual and are cued by our environment, not by continuous choice, right? Which basically means that like we are making these unconscious decisions all day long, and these habits are being built based off the environments that we're surrounded by, right? And for some of you that have listened this pretty consistently as far as the podcast go, I talk about environment and community kind of being in the same place because these are the external cues, these are the external influences that are going to dictate the choices that you make, the habits that you create, and the behaviors that you have, right? So thinking about how do I actually shape my environment to be conducive with the goal or the behavior change that I'm trying to make should be almost most of everyone's top priority. Because I personally, even though I put mindset at the number one and the foundation of the thing that's going to create the most change and happiness and success for people, I do think that it's easier in a good environment to make better choices and change the behaviors faster than it is for me to just talk my way into a behavior change. Because even though the mindset is the thing that's kind of like influencing the most, what's influencing the mindset is how we like, I've always said the best way to the mind is through the body. But then more importantly, like this, what we're talking about right now is like the environment, right? So an example I wrote down is you think you decided to snack, but it was triggered by seeing the chips on the counter, right? So like for me, the Doritos, like spicy nacho Doritos have been like this weird guilty pleasure that I've had the last like couple months. I will say I haven't had it in a couple weeks now, but like there is times where if I go to the grocery store, I have like, I would say a Snickers bar and some Doritos were like guilty pleasure snacks for me, right? And I grew up kind of, I wouldn't say eating a lot of crap, but like we always had like little snacks around the house. And I've always grew up with like a sweet tooth with like sodas and sweets. And it's been probably the thing that I struggle with the most on a dietary perspective is like I could be rock solid all day long, have a solid breakfast, have a solid lunch, just have coffee. I used to do energy drinks when I was in school and really young, but like, and then I'll have a really, really good dinner. But then the problem is like, I'll get home and I'll be bored or I'll be watching TV. And if it's at the house, I will choose to snack on it, right? So that was kind of one of those environment things of like, okay, if I decided or chose just to not to buy it, then I wouldn't struggle with that temptation, right? So it's like what that basically example I give is like, you're not choosing to go snack, right? The environment is creating an unconscious decision to choose, right? So what I mean by that is like you're not making the conscious decision to do it. It's just a habit you've created, right? And the hard part of like removing habits is if you've been doing something for a week, a month, a year, 5 years, 10 years, the longer that habit's been going on, obviously the harder it is to remove that habit from your lifestyle. So yes, it might feel right now that you're at a place in life where you're actually choosing to make the wrong decisions or choosing the behaviors that are obviously not ideal for what your goals are set out for yourself, but those have been influenced by your environment, right? You were living with people that were eating shitty food, or your parents ate a certain type of food, or your parents always had snacks at the house, right? And these things over time have started to create a habit of like, oh, that's like normal. And this is the thing that like, excuse me, this is the thing that I always have at night every time, like things like that. So the first thing to do to change the behavior is basically to change the environment, right? So in an example like that, here's always a nutrition tip that I like to give people is if you're shopping for food in person or ordering it online, do it after you eat, right? And this is kind of like a little psychological trick to the body that like you will make bad decisions when you're hungry, right? You will make those, and whatever the example might be, I'm just using food here. So if I'm hungry, I'm going to naturally gravitate towards being in a line, right? And that's where they kind of talk about all the, what's the name for it? I'm going to forget it. But basically all the things that are like, the candy bars, the gums, all the things when you're waiting in line to kind of like purchase your groceries. And it's very easy for me to be like, oh, we're like, yeah, a little candy, like when you're standing there for a while. That won't happen to me if I'm hungry or not hungry, if I'm full, right? That will happen to me more than half the time if I'm in the line and I'm starving because I just like, oh, I just need something right now, right? So that is one of those things. Like I would say, probably out of all the things I'm talking about today's episode, that would be the number one thing that I think you should make a priority is like, how do I optimize and change my environment to be more conducive to the behavior change that I'm trying to make, right? So, behavioral science takeaway: it's easier to design an environment for success than it is to rely on self control, which is what I just talked about. Okay, so even with perfect knowledge, if your environment makes the unhealthy option easier, your brain will default to it because the brain's main priority is energy efficiency, right? And this was something that I thought was a good little note to talk on because energy efficiency is basically just this idea that the body is always going to do what takes the least amount of energy to do, right? And when you think about this in relationship to habits, your body it requires a lot more energy to create a habit, right? It also requires a lot more energy to remove a current habit, right? So, but it's not something that requires a lot of energy to continue a habit, right? So this is why when you think about like it's much easier to stay rich once you get rich. It's much easier to stay in shape once you get in shape, right? And there's a little bit of science to the getting in shape, and there's a little bit of reasons obviously when you have money why it's easier to keep it outside of some of the behavioral stuff that we're talking about. But one of the big things from a behavior standpoint and a habit standpoint is your body is used to doing it. Your brain is used to doing the work or the actions or the behaviors that it needs to do to continue at that same rate, right? Or to keep a certain habit. So that is one thing when you think about energy efficiency is like your body is very, very smart. It's not going to choose the hard thing. That's where it's a little bit of like, okay, yes, there's a mental overcoming aspect of like, okay, I need to understand that it's going to be hard at the beginning and understand that like it might be hard for 3 weeks or 3 months or 6 months or a year. Obviously, depending on the size of the goal or the size of the behavior change you're making could dictate the timeline it's going to take. But you need to remember that it's also not going to feel like that forever. Like if I can give you anything that's empowering for you to understand that like once you get to a place where it's a habit, it's so much easier to maintain that habit, right? So, like another example I wrote down, which is basically talking about distractions, which is a little bit of like what I'm going to talk about, I think, next week on the podcast. But like for me, when I think about the biggest distraction that I have, and I think about distractions a lot, is like, how do I remove distractions? I think the phone for me is probably one of the biggest distractions that I personally deal with. And something I tell my wife a lot is like, I don't want the phones in the bedroom, right? Like, there's some little bit of some EMF, little nerdy biohacking part to this, but also I think like I don't want technology to be something that we have in bed, going to bed, or doom scrolling at night, or something that I wake up and I get on my phone to check emails and immediately trigger my body to go into the sympathetic state. Like in the perfect world, that habit that I want to change. And this is also another thing where you talk about the community influence. Like if you are living with your husband or wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, roommates, kids, family, whatever it might be, you need to remember that their habits become your habits. And if you want to change a personal habit of yours, it's important to make sure that the conversation is being had with the other person that you live with. That like, hey, so for me, hey, Nikki, babe, I would really like to get out of the habit of having this be accessible to us, right? So why don't we put our phones or our technology or our computer in the office, right? And after 9 p.m., we don't touch these things, right? And until 9 a.m. the next day, we don't touch these things, or whatever you want to structure it as. I think that's important because that is A, an environmental change. B, it's going to start to influence other people, which is going to help with some of the accountability, which is another thing that I kind of have here on the acronym that I'm going to give you guys. I think the accountability of having a support system, either a coach, a friend, a significant other, a family member, whatever it might be. There's a reason why people that pay for training tend to train more than those that, don't pay for it. And it's not because you need to pay for something. It's because when you pay for it, you're financially invested, which indirectly makes you psychologically invested. You're going to take things more serious when you pay for them, right? So like there's so many different layers of accountability I can give you. But when you come to like, what is this gap that we're talking about between knowledge and behavior, you need to create levels of accountability that make it easier for you to do so. Right. So for my client that brought up this entire idea of this podcast, one of the things she mentioned is like, hey, I know like taking steps for me is good, but I also like, I'm not in the habit of it yet, right? Like I don't feel like that's going to be the thing that's going to help me get closer to my goal or it's going to work. Right. And it's like, until you do it consistently long enough to actually see the change, Yeah, it's very easy for yourself to convince yourself that because motivation is a derivative of your progress, right? So it's like when you are seeing change and you're seeing progress, you tend to be motivated by it. Your body's going, oh, cool, this actually works, right? And I love this idea. Like Andrew Huberman was the one that I think said this the best is like, it's not said this the best, this is facts. It's like dopamine is in the pursuit, right? It's not in the catch, right? Meaning like we as humans get this dopamine hit in the pursuit of something, right? We don't get it when we actually get to that destination, right? So when you think about this and the habits that you're trying to change or the behaviors you're trying to change, your body does get a dopamine hit when you're actually taking action towards the goal, right? But today's podcast is like, why am I not even starting to take action? So that's where a little bit of the environment and staying accountable and accountability systems that you build yourself. But understand that the motivation will start to increase when you start to see change, right? So it's like if I give you a nutrition change and you immediately see some weight loss, or you immediately start to have improvement in energy, or you immediately start to feel improvement in your digestion, yeah, you're like, fuck yeah, this works. Let's keep going, right? So it's like that's why it's like you want to do things that are intense enough to see the change, but you want to do things that aren't too intense to discourage you from the amount of work that it actually takes to do so, right? So that's where there's like this, this seesaw effect of like, okay, I need to find the perfect little balance of enough intensity, but also not too much that burns them out, but also not too little that doesn't do anything for change. And I think that's one of the worst mistakes clients make when they join a gym. It's like, oh, I'm just going to start with like one time a week. I want to see if this works. And I'm like, barely anything in life works one time a week, right? Yes, it's 100% more than zero, but it's like, it's not enough for you to actually be excited about the results that are going to come from it, right? It's like jump in there, buckle up for a few weeks, understand it's going to be difficult no matter what. But now let's look at like, what are the things that I can do to make that part that is going to be difficult, and you should have that perspective and mindset going into it, a little bit easier for me to do, right? But that's kind of like this balancing act, okay? So section 2 is I want to kind of like, where does this show up in health, right? And this one will be a little bit short for this section, but like, okay, for me, I wrote down movement, nutrition, recovery, and mindset, right? Movement, knowing mobility prevents injuries, but how most people skip warm-ups and skip cooldowns, right? And I touched on this a little bit already, that like mobility is something even for myself I know is really, really important for recovery, moving well, postural improvements, an improvement in my performance, an improvement in muscle engagement. And it becomes more important the more sedentary we are because we move less, right? So with less movement means more priority on movement and mobility with our training. Now, from a compliance standpoint and a behavior standpoint, the knowledge of knowing that is one thing, right? But how do I actually get you to do that? Number one, when you start to move better, you might feel better, right? Or if I have someone that's injured, if I start to do more mobility and they get out of pain, that's a behavior change. That's going to be something that's going to motivate them. But how do I stack it with a habit that you enjoy, right? So Francisco, one of the guys that works here, he's a power lifter, right? Getting ready for a powerlifting event. And, in powerlifting or like a lot of strength sports, you do a lift and you take 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of rest. You take more rest with the heavier the lift and the lower the volume is, right? And the reason why is you want to give your body adequate rest to be able to actually produce enough energy to be able to do what you're looking to do. Same thing with like sprinting. It's like if I run a 100-meter sprint, I'm not going to rest for 10 seconds. I'm going to give myself enough time to rest in between to make sure that I'm adequately recovered. Now, how do I actually integrate mobility with someone like that, right? Like if he doesn't have the ability to get into a good deadlift position to create a strong enough brace or a good enough stability, he might start to feel his back work a little bit harder than it should. He might start to feel his hamstrings work a little bit harder and not his glutes. So what I would do for a client like that from a compliance standpoint is like, I would just basically integrate some soft tissue or some mobility in between a set. So instead of saying like, maybe this is someone that's notorious for skipping more, maybe this is someone that skips their cool down stretches, I'm like, let's just integrate it into the strength, right? So what I want you to do is instead of resting and sitting on your phone or sitting down, I want you to sit on a lacrosse ball and roll out your glutes a little bit. I want you to roll on your glute med, right? I want you to do some hamstring mobility or like a couple activation drills, or I want you to do some glute work or activation in between, whatever that might be. I mean, obviously super subjective here, but that would be a way for me that would be kind of a planning change that will allow him to be more compliant. Now, from a nutrition standpoint, the example, knowing snacking could lead to unnecessary calories, but then raiding your pantry every night to go watch TV. And this is a lot of what I just touched on again of like, how do I change the environment? How do I not buy these foods? How do I make sure that my family or roommates or people I live with don't have the stuff that's going to get me in trouble? And I think that is going to be more of an environmental change. But if we look at how do I change the behavior, it starts with kind of the initial cue, right? Which I think is going to be the shopping of food, right? If you're someone that's door dashing a lot versus cooking and like your goal is to cook more, that's like even another element because I think DoorDash is, remember this, that most things in life are built on hacking the psychology, right? Like social media is addicting because it hacks our psychology of like we get immediate gratification. Like, oh, funny video, interesting video. But the doom scrolling is just these little micro dopamine hits that I'm getting, right? DoorDash, it's much easier for me to just order food than it is for me to go to the grocery store, then prep it, then cook it, then clean the dishes versus just like click a couple buttons, have someone deliver it to you. It's already cooked. I don't even clean the dishes. I just throw it away. Now, getting out of that, and this is kind of where I think one of the things I wrote down here for the nutrition is like coming back to your why. And coming back to the importance of the goal. I think your goal is something you need to like, even in like, I remember football, we used to have like our mission statement or whatever it was above like the hallway entrance, and you see this in like athletic departments or some things. But for some people, it's like, I remember as a kid, having the Ferrari poster, having these like little motivational things around you. You need to have enough in your environment in kind of like the stimulus needs to be around the why, right? The stimulus needs to be around the importance of the goal, right? Like, yes, eating some chips at night or eating a sweets or eat sweets at night might feel good right now. But what I want you to remind yourself of, more importantly, is also how good would it feel to have that 40 pounds less in body? How good would it feel to be the 15% body fat? How good would it feel to wake up without pain? Like, find the pain point, find the goal, and understand that you need to figure out a way for you to create habits around the things that are going to get you closer to it, right? So from a cooking example, it's like, my wife and I, we go in like little seasons, and I would say she's definitely way better at this than I am. Is like sometimes when I'm lazy or burnt out or have no energy after work, I'm like, let's just DoorDash tonight, and we do this more on the weekends. Now here's the thing. Can you DoorDash and be healthy? The answer is yes. Can you DoorDash and be unhealthy? Absolutely. Now the likelihood of you choosing an unhealthy food on DoorDash versus going to the grocery store and shopping for yourself is probably higher. So it's just like a probability of failure is just going to be a lot higher when you set yourself up for failure, right? Because it's like, okay, if I am tired, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds way better versus getting something healthier, right? And then the quality of the foods and all the other things that go into it. So, but I think coming back to the why and really like, okay, how do I set myself up for like, number one, if you go to the grocery store once a week, or even if you order it, like make it easy, order all the food. You're less likely to waste the money when you spend a few $100 on groceries every week, right? Versus then like, if I have all these groceries in the fridge, I'm probably less likely to DoorDash, right? So the first thing you should do, even if you don't even have the energy or the habit built of going to the grocery store, order it, right? Spend the money on it. Get the quality food. Because for most of us, we don't like losing money, right? We don't want to lose anything, right? So if you set yourself up to be like, well, why the hell would I DoorDash tonight when I have $400 of groceries in the fridge right now? So think about like, okay, what are the little actions that I need to take first that are still easy for me to do? So like someone that's DoorDashing, I'm like, okay, I want you to order food instead of ordering DoorDash. Order all your groceries for the week, all the produce, all the meats, whatever it is, right? Mindset, knowing mindfulness reduces stress, but being too busy to pause it. Super common for so many people, including myself, of like taking the time to actually give yourself a break when you know it's going to be the thing that's actually going to help you be more productive and efficient and effective when you are working. And I think that's part of like the hustle culture thing that I talk about a lot of, like where people burn themselves out and overwork. And like, instead of working 12 hours a day at 70% effort, I'd rather work, 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day or even 4 hours a day at 90+% effort. So maximizing your time, I think, is a big one too. Okay, so last one. This is kind of a fun little acronym that I put together, and it's called BALANCE, right? And you can thank ChatGPT for helping me structure this. B, breaking it down. Make the first step ridiculously small. So if I talk about mobility or if I talk about exercise, maybe something that would be like an easy goal for somebody to just start the habit is like, if I'm not doing anything by myself, I want a client to go do a run 3 times a week, right? Maybe what I'm going to have them do is like, I want you to give me 10 push-ups a day. Like, it's just, so small. Like, you want to just break down the goal where it seems almost laughable that that's even being suggested to you. And really what you're like you need to understand is it's not what you're doing that's really going to move the needle. It's what you're doing is creating a habit of doing, right? Like we're trying to get in the habit of action. We're trying to get in the habit of doing something. So something I tell clients a lot of times when they join gyms is like, don't make your weight loss or the thing that you're here for your immediate goal. Make your immediate goal showing up to every session that you pay for the first month, right? If I'm a 3-time-week client, I show up to all 12 of my sessions because that goal is A, going to give you a psychological win of cool, I just did something that I committed myself to. B, it doesn't get you defeated when you don't lose your 20 pounds in the first month, like the ridiculous goals that most of us have, because we forget that like time is something that's time is something that's required to hit all goals, and it doesn't happen overnight because you didn't get there overnight. So that's like an easiest one I can give you guys to just break down what you're trying to do. So whatever habit or behavior change you're trying to create, break it down into such a small actionable item that it feels laughable, right? So it's like if I'm walking 2,000 steps a day, instead of making 8,000 the goal, make 3,000, make 2,500, right? Make that goal week one. Then the next week add another 500,000. Like just understand that like if you're having trouble even just executing on anything, you need to make it small and digestible. Number two, anchor the routines, right? Attach a habit to something you've already do, right? This is like, I think James Clear talks about this. It's like, oh, if I want to go running after work, right? Bring my running shoes to work, right? Don't go home, sit on the couch for 10 minutes, then put on my running shoes, right? Like just run from work and then go home, right? Like little things that are what we call habit stacks is just like if I can anchor it to something that I'm already doing, it's much easier to continue that habit, right? Number three, limit friction, right? Prep the environment so you make good choices easier, right? So that example can be used that way as well, right? It's like, okay, if I want to go to the gym after work, I need to make sure that I have my gym bag by the door or something when I leave for work, right? Like make sure that I limit friction and I make it as easy as possible to actually get there. Number four, accountability. Probably on second to biggest one to environment for me, if not bigger than some of that, is tell someone and train with somebody or track it in public, right? I love public commitments. You know, for me, it's like I use Instagram sometimes. Like I don't want to embarrass myself. So making an announcement in public or announcing it to a team forces me indirectly to take it more serious because like, fuck, I just put my word out there and I want to make sure I'm a man of my word. So I commit to it, right? But accountability could be doing this with somebody. Accountability could be, you know, betting on yourself, right? Like I think this is like an underutilized thing. It's like if I'm in a relationship, I would tell like, hey, I'm gonna give you $1,000, babe, to go shopping and do whatever you want with my money if I fail in this goal. So I'm gonna put my money, I'm gonna put my word, and I'm gonna have commitment from her, right? So do things that create accountability, and there's so many different layers. Next one is nurture identity. Huge one. I think when any type of change, you need to understand that you need to nurture the identity change that's going to be created in order for you to be successful with that, right? So see yourself as the kind of person versus instead of trying to be healthy, right? So like, I am a healthy person. I am a person that works out. I'm not trying to be someone that's trying to be healthy. I'm not trying to be someone that goes to the gym because then you're just leaving your body an unconscious ability to fail, right? You need to understand that whoever you want to be is who you are, right? Like let that resonate. Like whoever you want to be, whatever goal you have set out, that needs to be in your head, the story and the narrative and the perspective that you have moving forward. So it's like, if I want to be this lean person, if I want to be the strong person, in my head, I'm like, I am the strong person. I am this person that works out. I am this person that eats enough protein. I am this person that actually recovers well enough to be able to do so. So the identity change, obviously being a huge win. Next one, celebrate micro wins. So many of us, I think, are too hard on ourselves with expecting too much too fast, right? I remember that when I opened up the business, I was like, yeah, I'm going to be driving supercars. I'm going to be a millionaire in a couple of years. And running a business now for 8.5 years, I'm going to tell you right now, it's a fuck ton slower than you want it to be, right? Not just business, but making change in your physical health, making change in your mental health, making change in your relationships. We view things, we overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in a decade. I love that. I think that's Bill Gates who made that quote. And really, I think we need to make sure that we're making it a strong enough effort to celebrate the little wins that go on, because little wins are wins, right? Little wins are psychological motivators for us, right? So like make sure that all these little things are trackable. And this is why, like for me with the business, I like to track weights. I like to track times. I like to track body composition. I like to track mobility screens. I like to track whatever it is, because the more variables I have to track, the more opportunities I have to do to keep you motivated, right? Last one, evaluate and adjust, reflect weekly. And then just make sure that you're always tweaking the plan instead of quitting, right? A lot of times we get knocked off our high horse once, and I see this all the time with clients. join a gym, they're there, they go on vacation or they get injured and they just immediately just fall off track, right? Like just understand that like there needs to be reflection, something that's frequently done, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever you want to do depending on the severity. And then you need to make sure you're just making these little, and I like this to think about you guys as more of like I am this optimization perspective versus always thinking about it is like quitting, right? So that's my one on that. I hope it's something that's digestible and usable for you guys. Understand that knowledge is one thing. We have an overabundance of knowledge and information, but changing the behavior is the hardest part of what we do as humans. So just understand that there's little ways that you guys can go about your life to actually make a behavior change. So hope that guys, hope that helps. See you guys.